everyone, Dr. Jen from Wellness in 2 Words. Having some technical difficulties this morning, and sorry about the lighting. I am engaging in social distancing and doing this video from my house. My kids are home from school, and I just wanted to take a moment to kind of discuss the landscape of coronavirus as I understand it as an emergency medicine physician who's spent many years trying to sort out a lot of these viral outbreaks and the information that we're given, those kind of things. And it really is one of those things that you really have to take a minute, take a deep breath. So here's my 2-word phrase for the day is stay calm. Okay? Stay calm. Because number one, if you start to get stressed and you start to stress your immune system by pumping out cortisol, whether or not you perceive it's necessary or unnecessary, it's going to hamper your immune response, and that's not what you want. You want to stay strong, you want to stay well, you want to stay healthy. I know the things that I do that benefit me. I can't make recommendations for every single person, but I do think in general, getting hysterical about things is not going to help, okay? That's not to say that this is not to be taken seriously, because I do strongly feel after staying up most of late into the evening last night, researching some of this stuff that's kind of emerging information, my thoughts and feelings about this particular situation have actually changed to a degree. And now people are asking me for personal advice, which is a whole different space because I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm an emergency medicine physician. There's a very big difference. But in terms of kind of breaking down the data, that's what I hope to do, is drop some knowledge on you today about what this situation is and questions about the future. Okay, and I'm sorry that this lighting is really bad. I guess it's because I'm tired. I don't know. Let's see if I can switch it a little bit. Help make it not seem so bright. Okay, first of all, this is an emerging picture. All of this is subject to change. I can't imagine a more challenging job than to work for the World Health Organization or the CDC. And at one point I even thought I wanted to go work at the CDC. I was going to get a degree in immunology because I find it fascinating to do the detective work. However, these are human lives that are at stake. So when they are making recommendations and policy decisions, understand they're not doing this in a place that's being done capriciously. I mean, they're trying to really sort out what's new, what's different. Let's do the detective work. So if you're trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle, but the picture's always changing, that would be really hard. So I have an infinite amount of grace for the officials that are in these positions, because garbage in, garbage out, right? So your decisions are only as good as the information that you are given, and you want to make sure you are getting accurate information. So understand, this is what I see based on what I consider to be accurate sources like CDC websites, some emergency medicine literature that I have access to, that kind of thing. Okay, so if you do nothing, it's a trap. If you do something, it's a trap. Nobody can win. So I think hysteria is uncalled for. I think hoarding is uncalled for. I don't get the toilet paper thing. Anyway, I think it's irresponsible to dismiss the severity or potential severity of this disease, because this is the first pandemic to be declared that is caused by a coronavirus, right? We've seen coronaviruses before. We've seen outbreaks before. They've never been declared at the level of a pandemic. So knowing that this is new and different territory, this is the first pandemic to be caused by a coronavirus, creates all kinds of different questions. So I wouldn't dismiss its severity, but I do think it's also irresponsible to project like these doomsday projections. I mean, one number that somebody said, 75 million Americans, if they were infected, if you calculate the current mortality rate, that's a crazy amount of Americans that would be, fatalities, 2 million. So I think a lot of that is entirely preventable by doing the things that we should be doing every day anyway, right? Washing your hands, covering your cough. I tell my kids, do the Dracula, but then this is not going to be a clean space. So making sure that all those basic hygiene practices that we should be doing, CDC is recommending them over and over again. But the new territory is the new level where we are saying, hey, let's cancel non-essential travel. Don't go to the hospital just because you have a sore throat, right? Like, if you're having fever, cough, and difficulty breathing, absolutely you should be at the hospital. But just like minor aches, wait and see where it goes. Maybe it's the flu, maybe it's not. Having some common sense about some of the things that they're recommending is important. Okay, so let me see. So what do we know about COVID-19? First of all, the nomenclature is such that COVID-19 is actually the disease that is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it was called novel virus because it was brand new. We'd never seen this particular strain. When this whole outbreak started, they actually started doing genomic sequencing of the samples they had and found out that there were some key differences in the genome that made it a completely new strain of virus, right? It wasn't something they'd seen before. And those key differences actually were potentially responsible for its ability to be sustainably and easily spread human to human. Okay, so first of all, it is a coronavirus. It is called that because when you look at its structure, you know, on an electron microscopy type situation, it's looks like it's a crown. It's studded with these proteins, and these proteins are important for its activity. So the proteins that it's studded with are called S proteins or spike proteins, and those are responsible for its interface with your cells. Basically the way it kind of docks. It attaches to certain receptors on human cells, specifically in this case, more likely in the lung, and that's where it exerts its activity and its infectivity basically. So it docks, it pokes a hole, puts the membranes in puts the viral particles in membranes and then starts to reproduce, that kind of thing. But it does some things that are also kind of different. So the protein that they've discovered that it binds to is called, I don't know what happened to my network connection. Sorry. It's called ACE2. So you've heard people talk about drugs that are called ACE inhibitors, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. In your lung tissue, specifically what they're finding is this ACE2, which is kind of like the on-off switch for conversion of this protein in your system that regulates blood pressure. This is the off switch. So when this ACE2 protein is occupied by the virus, it increases a person's potential for acute respiratory distress syndrome. So this is a whole bunch of scientific knowledge I just dropped on you, but basically there's a protein called ACE angiotensin converting enzyme. It cleaves off a piece of a protein, and then you have an active substance that regulates blood pressure. But for everything in your body, there's a check and a balance, right? So the thing that kind of takes that system back in the lung tissue is ACE2. That's where this virus attacks, is on that receptor. So it doesn't mean it does just that. It has other functions, but that's why we see a higher potential for the respiratory distress syndrome, because it's involved in that mechanism on a cellular level. Super sciencey, sorry. There are also other proteins, the E protein, which is the envelope protein, that appears to be very, very critical in the viral replication. So when they've had, clinical trials with mice with SARS even before, see, like, some of this isn't new. SARS had a coronavirus that they found the same features with it. Just this seems more virulent, more capable of causing more severe disease, right? So they had seen that before they did trials with mice to say, okay, what about this protein? What does it do? That kind of thing. So this E protein in mice that had a virus that didn't have the E protein, it didn't reproduce the same. So it's a potential target for a vaccine, right? If you can knock out this E protein, which is essential for the virus's replication and reproduction, then you have potential to stop its activity in your body, and that would be a great target for a vaccine. I feel like I'm going off the rest of this. Anyway. Okay, so what else we know about this virus? When did it occur? So anything that you're detecting, you have to have a 0.0, right? This could have kind of been in the background and not as virulent, and no one was looking for it, so no one was detecting it, so no one was recording the number of cases. But at some point, you have to have a 0.0, and that's December of 2019. There was an individual identified in Wuhan who, I think he was an employee at the market, this live market, where the virus potentially started and jumped to humans. So let's see. That's different. Going through my notes. So bats tend to be a reservoir for this variety of coronavirus. They have not identified an intermediate host. For instance, when you look at SARS and MERS, they had an intermediate host, even though maybe coronavirus still was a reservoir of bats. It had to jump to an intermediate host and then to people. For those, I think it was like civet cats and camels and stuff. They haven't identified an intermediate host for this virus yet. However, what they did find was as the cases started to become more frequent, not that many people had been to the seafood market, right? Or this live animal market. So they determined quickly that this was human-to-human contact was spreading this. And that's where they had to figure out exactly how. We now know it is droplet spread. Droplet precautions are important. And if you really want to make yourself crazy, just think about your average sneeze or cough. When you look at the research on that, your average cough is a velocity of 50 miles an hour with an average spread of 3,000 droplets. And then your average sneeze is twice that, 100 miles per hour with over 100,000 droplet potential for spread. So cover your cough, cover your sneeze. Don't go somewhere if you're sick. Don't spread it to other people. And that's the other thing they found. When you look at the R0, it's designated like R0, that's basically the viral reproduction rate in people, right? So for every one person who's infected, they're finding on average 2.2 to 2.5 people get infected. So if you're infectious, you're going to infect probably 2 to 2.5 people. That's why the numbers keep climbing, right? So here's how you prevent that. Socially distance. Isolate yourself if you're sick. Super important because it's not just about you, it's about other people, and potential for transmission, especially the fact that it's easily and sustainably spread, is key for this, right? So, and keep in mind, this doesn't account for super spreaders. So in infectious disease, there's this phrase called super spreaders. People who may more efficiently spread the virus, have more viral particles in their secretions, may not have and it sounds like a judgment, but may not have the most tight hygiene. So, or they may just be very social, like their job or their situation may require them to be around people much more than other people who may work from home. So their potential to spread the virus to even more people is there. So that's why one of the things that they're suggesting is this social distancing because of the rate of transfer of this virus. Average incubation is about 4 days. There have been people who have actually gone, they said basically if you suspect you've been exposed, if you go past the 12-day to 14-day mark, you're unlikely to get the virus. So like 95% of people will show symptoms within 12 to 14 days after a known exposure. Okay, there are outliers. There was one person documented, I think it was up to 19 days, which is, that's almost 3 weeks. This is why they're saying in this environment for these cycles, 3 weeks is like a really good idea, because if you can kind of stop that cycle and prevent spread within that 3-week time frame, most people aren't going to be outside of that will continue to be infectious, right? So 2 weeks is 95% of people. You're looking up to 3 weeks will get probably everybody. Okay, so a little bit more about the virus. RNA viruses are more likely to mutate because, single strand RNA viruses, which is what this is. This is a single strand beta RNA virus. So which means you have one copy of all the proteins that it's going to encode for. Its blueprint is one single strand. So one mutation in that is going to change everything about it. It's like if you had a smudge on a Xerox machine, now every copy is going to have that smudge. You add another smudge, it's going to have another smudge. So because it's highly mutable, it changes how it acts, which means this is important for pandemic potential, right? Because as it mutates, your body's never seen it before. It could mutate to something less favorable and it could die out. It can mutate to something more favorable and make it even more virulent. We don't know that. We don't know what's going to happen yet. We just know where we are right now. So one thing they found in this particular virus is 2 mutations were present at 2 different base pairs, and they think that that's what triggered its ability to jump to human transmission and human contact. So what happens then, and kind of let me just explain that. When you think about, I feel like I'm giving you information without giving you the backstory. RNA, DNA, all of that genetic material, it's not just like a yardstick. I mean, it's folded, it's complex, it's three-dimensional, it's like super coiled, it's all these different things. You change one base pair, or you change two base pairs, you change how those proteins fold. And when you change how they fold, you change their three-dimensional structure. It's like changing a key. And then suddenly there's a new notch that wasn't there before, and now it can interface with something and open the lock when before it wouldn't have worked, if that makes any sense. Okay, so protein folding, structure, all important for human transmission. When you look at other coronaviruses, and to give you some perspective on this, I'm going to try to link some resources if I can after this talk. Some viruses kill their host too quickly. Classic case, Ebola, hemorrhagic fever. I mean, you're 72 hours out, your mortality is incredibly high. It's really hard to transmit a disease that causes such significant mortality so quick. That virus tends to die out faster because, number one, it gets people's attention really fast. And so quarantine happens really quickly. And number two, the host can't really be out and active and running around and shedding virus because they're so sick. So this is different than Ebola, right? Because you can still be walking around and have a fever and a cough and be functional, versus Ebola puts the brakes on really fast and kills its host much faster. So that's why when it comes to quarantine again, because of pandemic potential, that's why these recommendations are being made, because the host is still very functional while actively shedding virus. Okay. And I don't even want to get started about the live animal markets. Animals should not be in such close proximity of so many different species in such a place. And then humans on top of it. It was never intended. We weren't intended to be like that. So that's probably one of those things that really just needs to be cracked down on a worldwide basis. But let's see, incubation and droplet spread. We talked about that. There's a 6-foot bubble zone. I would make it even higher, knowing what I know now, just because it's why take chances. Fomites. So fomites, the definition of a fomite is a surface that you can get an infection from that's an inert object, not a person. So somebody wipes their nose and on a doorknob, whatever. I mean, just nasty. But if they do that, though, the real question is how much of this virus is spread through fomites. And we still don't know. We're still learning more about the virus and its actual characteristics. So it's hard to make recommendations for it. I would assume all fomites could be contagious, but you don't know. It could just be more just droplet person to person, and it has to hit a mucous membrane. Point is, if you touch a surface, you don't have to go crazy with the hand sanitizer, but if you touch a surface, wash your hands, don't touch your eyes, don't touch your nose, those kind of things. Because that's how you could potentially get infected. Again, we don't know the percent transmission, but if you have nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, so if you look at the China data that came in early, the China report, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea were less than 5% of people had those symptoms. So I'd say if you have predominant GI symptoms, it's not likely to be coronavirus. It could be flu, it could be something else, it could be rotavirus, it could be any number of other things, but nausea, vomiting, diarrhea were not typical of most people who had infection. 95% of people did not have those symptoms. Okay. Symptoms they did have were fever and cough. Fever was less common than cough, right? So cough was 68% of people, and then accompanied with resultant respiratory distress as it progressed. You could have an absolutely normal white blood cell count, but what they did notice is the lymphocyte count was lower. So that had some implication with it. And of course, we know now that people who have chronic medical conditions, who are chronically ill, or people who are elderly are much, much higher risk, which is again why they're recommending non-essential visits to facilities, to visit family and nursing homes, assisted living, all of that. Really need to curtail that because they're very fragile, and you could actually make them, you could actually increase the mortality rate just by visitation alone, because you might not have a fever and you may not have symptoms yet, but you could still be transmitting the virus to someone because the incubation time is 4 days. Think about that. Okay, let's talk about lab testing. Anytime we're trying to find out the source for something or test with a lab, one of the things that you have to look at is how is this test structured, right? So when we test for coronavirus, or I say we, but when they are testing for coronavirus, they're taking a swab from the nose or the mouth, and in the really sick patients in ICU, a bronchiolar lavage, where they take lung washings, and they look at that for the presence of virus. Now, you can look for, say, a characteristic protein, which is the antigen test, which a lot of them like rapid strep and rapid flu do. Or in this particular case, because this is relatively new, we don't have as many of those type tests. They do nucleic acid amplification. Fancy term for we're going to take all this little genetic material that's on that little swab and we're going to make multiple copies of it until we hit a threshold and we can identify that's what it is, okay? So it's kind of like a Xerox soup, if you will. Kind of oversimplification of it, but it's a polymerase chain reaction. They mix it with ingredients that help the genetic material grow and amplify, and there's these little markers that are fluorescent, and when you hit a certain threshold of enough of those to trigger a positive test, they say it's positive. It's about 70-something% specific from what my understanding is, but again, I don't have access to a ton of data, but I'm going to try to find out more about that later. But so that means if you have a negative test, it doesn't mean you don't have the virus. Don't assume that you're just fine, because you could be missing up to 20 to 30% of people, right? If you have a positive test, it's not a death sentence, right? But understand, you could have a positive test and also be positive for the flu, or also be positive for strep. Just because one test is positive doesn't mean another test won't be positive. So keep in mind, people can have co-infection. They can have more than one infection at a time, right? So just keep in mind limitations of the test. But it definitely, when a test is positive, is showing presence of that RNA virus. Okay. One of the things they did was they tried to centralize testing to go through public health forums. They're now releasing some of those restrictions so that there's less of a delay in identifying cases, because they were getting a backlog. I mean, can you imagine the overwhelm? There's this case, more cases. If you centralize that too much and don't release it to private labs, then you create a unnecessary delay. If those labs are adequately accredited and they can do the testing and they've passed the quality controls for it, then private labs are going to be able to test more. So what that means is more people presenting with symptoms that are suspicious, that get a test that comes back positive, we're able to identify more of them. So it's not just a prevalence thing, it's also a detection thing, right? Because there may be people out there that had respiratory symptoms that were like, we don't know what you're sick with, you're negative for the flu. We didn't have a test at the time to actually identify them. And so were they coronavirus? We don't know. This has been going on since December in China, and we're a global mobile population, so hard to say if people who were sick with something in January had coronavirus, but we didn't have a way to test for it yet, right? So keep in mind it's a reportable disease. So we will get accurate information for the positive tests to go to public health officials, because every test that's positive has to be reported. That's just the law. And reportable diseases like this are very important, right? I feel like I'm talking very fast and I apologize. So let's look at the actual China data. There is a report where you've seen a lot of graphs that circulate on the internet. A lot of them are extrapolating from this data. It's a really good paper, and I can also link that to you. So in the China data, there were 7,700 people at the time of this report, but they only had accurate data for 1,099. So let's round it up to 1,100 for easy purposes. So, which is about 14% of the patients, because those were the ones that they could track to a terminal endpoint. When I say terminal, I don't mean death. It just means a definitive endpoint that they could say either they recovered or they died, right? The ones that are out there that you lost to follow up or you didn't have all the data on, you can't make any assumptions about. So they're being very responsible in saying, of these 1,099 people, we know exactly what happened to them, period. Less than 1%, about 1% were less than 15 years old, okay? So age is a factor. 926 of them were identified as positive and they had non-severe illness. In other words, they recovered completely, no problems. 173 were severe, which again was about 15%. So of those, the majority of them were greater than 54 years old. So again, When you're older patient, you're at higher risk. We still don't understand why. Does it have something to do with where the virus attacks in the lung? Does it have something to do with the body's response? Is it part of your innate immune response? Is it part of the lymphocyte immune response? There's still many of those questions that need to be answered. In that China report, the mortality rate was approximately like 2.83%. So it definitely was 10 times that of the flu, or greater than that of the flu. The flu is less than 1%, and this one is actually much higher. But of the coronaviruses and of the total outbreaks that we've seen, like SARS and MERS, those kind of things, it's still one of the least deadly. Because, let's say, I'll take you down. That's in 2003, SARS had 8,000 cases, 774 deaths. It was a 9.6 mortality rate, which is 3 times what this virus has. 2012 in MERS, and we still see some sporadic MERS cases, but not the level of the initial outbreak. 2,229 cases with 791 deaths. That was a 35% mortality. So still, it's not as deadly, but it is more widespread. That's why they're calling it a pandemic. A pandemic's not about the total body count. A pandemic's about the geographic spread, right? So that's why the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. Now, if it were to mutate and get more severe, you could have that mortality go higher. If you quarantine people and stop the cycle of the virus, you can contain that rate. So that's why the whole push of hashtag flatten the curve is there. So recommendations as of now: social distancing, wash your hands, basic hygiene, do the Dracula, stay home if you're sick. It's not just about you. Essential, so non-essential travel and event cancellation, anything elective, try to cancel it for the short term. And we all understand that has financial ramifications. Don't misunderstand. But there are also ramifications when you have an already, quote, lean and mean medical system who has a razor thin margin that they're operating on because Medicare comes in and takes money away on these recovery audits. That there's a lot of people who refuse to pay for healthcare. Insurers, negotiate different rates. So when you have a lean and mean medical system, which is a lot of what ER physicians are practicing in the emergency room, we're always short-staffed. We often don't have access to the resources we need. There are often bed capability where we're boarding patients in the ER because there aren't any available beds upstairs because there aren't any nurses to work. So when you factor all of that in there, and then you inundate even with just a small percentage of these cases that require medical care, that system is at risk, which is why they're making the recommendations that they're making. So on the horizon, things that are helpful that will help us identify the whole course of this virus. Right now, there's not a blood test. They're working on trying to get a blood test for it to see if in your bloodstream you have antibodies which show that you have been exposed. Now, keep in mind, antibody response follows a particular pattern. So say I get exposed to the virus, my body's going to go, what's happening? My innate immune response is going to come in and try to just kill whatever it can, which is, spike a fever, try to just basically make my whole environment inhospitable for the virus in every way possible, which is thermostat, pH, all those kind of things. But what your body will start to do is go, we need to have a specific missile for this virus. So we're going to look at it, see what protein it has on it. We're going to make an antibody against it. So you have IgM, you have IgA, and then you have IgG. The most sophisticated, most targeted response is IgG immunity. So that's when you have literally a lock and key where it just sticks right on that protein that may be specific or whatever to the virus, and then your body just takes it out of circulation and nips it in the bud. That takes weeks to develop. So when somebody would have a blood test, say, that's positive for an IgG antibody against this virus, that means they were exposed weeks ago, probably, not yesterday. So blood tests are going to have limitations because there's always going to be a lag time depending on which antibody response you're looking for. Viral culture. They've just recently been able to have viral culture where they have a virus they can actually work with and study it and reproduce it and look at characteristics of it, find out what it's sensitive to, what kills it, those kind of things. So All of that is still yet unknown. They know characteristics of basic coronaviruses, but what's specific and unique to this virus is still not yet known. So that is on the horizon, but it's going to be a while before we have that information. And the other thing too, they're finding out when you look at geomapping of global incidents, temperature and heat seem to have a role in that. My kitty's coming to join us. So temperature, the geomapping, there's like a belt of certain temperatures where it seems to predominate more. If you look at the Johns Hopkins map, and there's actually a paper out about that too. So if it's UV sensitive, if it's heat sensitive, which they think it may be, that's going to have implications for just environment and geomapping. We do know that lipid solvents like ethanol and some other substances dissolve the membrane. So greater than 60% alcohol is required, which is 120 proof. So whatever you got at home that can do that, but that's why the rush for sanitizer is there. We know that it can kill it, but honestly, a better prevention is washing your hands and using soap and water. Just for the record, I have not bought toilet paper or hand sanitizer since this whole thing started. I had a little back stock of my Thieves hand sanitizer that I love, but I haven't gone to the store for either. So don't panic. Now, I will say things that are concerning and things that kind of made me change my mindset about this virus. The situation in Italy is very sobering. They had kind of a hybrid system in terms of single payer, not quite socialized, or a government system along with some private input and supplements, but they have a disproportionately aging population as well. So I think that's why they're also hit disproportionately, but also population density is a big key in this. So when you look at China and some other countries that were able to really force their citizens to quarantine early, they got a hold of the virus a whole lot earlier. You look at Western worlds, we're used to a lot more freedom. We're used to a lot more mobility. We think we're kind of immune to that. And I think that that would be a very sobering thought to kind of say, hey, you don't get to do whatever you want just because you want to. Like, you really need to think about the potential for what this virus can do. So I think that's an important lesson. Okay. So again, first pandemic caused by a coronavirus. Mutations can favor viral spread and decrease your immune specificity. Like, your immune system's like, wait, what happened? The thing we were looking at, now it's different. We got to attack a new target. Put this over here. My cat is driving me crazy right now. So I think that perspective is important. You know, these outbreaks, we're human, we're vulnerable, we're not bulletproof to so many things. And they kind of create a call to action to go, hey, everybody needs to work together. And we really need to think about creating policies that are important and make it not about politics. It needs to be about people. Again, not about politics. It needs to be about people, period. That's kind of anyway, that's just that. Let's see. So I have a couple quotes I'm going to read to you, and I'm probably going to just wrap this up for now. Here's a quote, and I'm going to have to find the sources because I didn't put the footnotes on it, but in the time since the publication of the data, which as of this morning on the tracker, the Johns Hopkins tracker, which I can link as well, 137,066 cases worldwide, 5,069 deaths, which gives you today, as of today, a mortality rate of 3.69%, a little higher than what it was before. So in the time since the publication of the data, the global disease burden of COVID-19 has come to drastically outpace that of the previous two novel coronavirus outbreaks. And this was when the data showed that it was 78,000 cases. COVID-19 is the deadliest of the novel coronaviruses in absolute magnitude while approximating the mortality rate. So what that means is those others had fewer deaths because they were very contained. It has still killed more people in spite of a smaller mortality rate. So MERS, mortality rate of 35%, but only killed 700 something people. This is more widespread, so it's more deadly, but the mortality rate, the percentage of people that die from it is smaller, if that makes any sense. This means in many places, health authorities are only picking up a small subset of the sick, okay? Perhaps the most severe cases, given that 80% of people with COVID-19 have a mild case. Remember, the sickest are usually the ones who show up at doctors' offices and hospitals, while there may be hundreds of thousands of others with the virus who never show symptoms and don't bother to go see a doctor. That's why the case fatality rate can often look much worse in the early days of an outbreak, which makes perfect sense, right? You can't count a percentage of something you don't know is there, that may be in the background. I will say this, our church recently sent out an email, and I thought it was a great quote. This is from Wes Wallace. He's an adjunct professor at Chapel Hill. He's on the state medical assistance team and the federal disaster assistance team in Chapel Hill. It says, quote, "If we use social distancing to slow transmission of COVID-19, patients will arrive at hospitals at a much slower rate, and life-saving treatment for the critically ill will remain available. Additionally, we will be given more time to manufacture protective gear for healthcare workers, do research that may lead to identification of effective medicines, and perhaps experience a seasonal decline in disease transmission rates, period. For social distancing to be effective, it must begin early. So early that it may feel unneeded and silly. If we wait until its need is obvious, it's too late." And he even goes on to say, "The faith community has an important role to play in slowing the spread of disease transmission. Large gatherings of people are a method for spreading infection for a period of time. We recommend that people suspend traditional gatherings, et cetera, et cetera." So I think if we're too late to quarantine, that could just open up a whole host of problems. So again, I don't want to be a Chicken Little. I want to kind of be a little judicious about this and not make a rush to judgment. But, we didn't have a spring break trip planned for our family. We're doing a staycation anyway. And I'm actually grateful that they have decided to cancel schools. And I think that trying to approximate that incubation window, pushing it up to about 3 weeks, is very judicious. I just think within our communities, I understand small businesses are reliant on people to come in and support them. So I think from a financial standpoint, do as much as you can safely. But if you're sick, stay home. And then practice the social distancing as you are able to. But we're going to have to be really careful. We're going to have to watch this closely. So let me see if there's anything else I wanted to share. I have so many little papers here. I'm kind of curious about some of the cellular science that's going to come out of this. Oh, this is an important graph. I printed this off. This is basically, it's the China, Eastern Mediterranean, America. It includes all of these, and it shows the emergence of cases. So I just think that's an important graph. And this is as of March 11th. They're not messing around. There's a reason why they're making the recommendations they are. And I was kind of like, on the very beginning, kind of changing my mind about that a little bit, just because I think, why shouldn't you? Okay. I think that's it for now. There may be more later. So, Wellness in 2 words. Thank you for watching. I appreciate you listening. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I'll try to link some of these resources. We'll be monitoring this for sure. But definitely stay calm. Don't get too stressed out, because your immune system needs you to be calm. It needs to be good. And I'm going to keep doing all my supplements that I do every day anyway. So, love you guys. Thanks for watching. And please feel free to share. And I'll try to put this also on my YouTube channel as well. Thanks.